Hello, you are going to learn the concrete methods to create a beautiful lawn yourself, even if you have zero gardening experience. As a landscaper, I see many individuals making terrible mistakes, irreversible mistakes that force them to start over. So if you don't want to be part of this category that has to redo everything, well, we'll keep the things not to do for the end of this video. Stay attentive. In total, we will have 6 steps. The first step will be to shave the existing grass. For this, you will take a brush cutter or a mower if it is accessible. We will also remove everything lying around. It could be toys, branches, etc. Once that is done, you can rake the grass and put it aside with a rake. Some people use chemical weeding. Personally, I find it unnecessary. You will see that my method is 100% natural, and I advise you to do the same. If we can avoid chemicals, it will be much better for the planet. Step number 2 will be to turn the soil. Here you have the choice of using either a rototiller with wheels, which will be really handy if you have a large area. Personally, I have one, so I will use that, or a tiller. The tiller has no wheels and will have a little more difficulty going deep, but hey, it still does the job. For a 200 square meter garden, for example, it may be a bit long, but it will save you from spending too much money. Another option is the stone barrier, also called a soil preparer, which allows for a perfect finish. However, it often needs to be attached to a tractor. This step is essential to refine the soil and turn over the clumps of grass present. There, I was in total struggle mode. In fact, there were acacia roots everywhere on the ground. For those who have a terrain with a lot of rocks, there is the stone barrier I mentioned. It has internal blades that rotate in a way that buries the stones, so you will have much fewer rocks to remove. Whereas the rototiller will bring the stones to the surface. Clearly, if you don't have equipment at home, it is always possible to rent a rototiller or a tiller or even borrow one. I went over everything once. You don't necessarily have to go in all directions. It just needs to be well loosened with no large clumps of grass. Then you don't have to, but for small difficult areas like around trees or the clothesline, I use the tiller because it is much more manageable. It's really because I want a nice result. Otherwise, I wouldn't have bothered. Before moving on to the third step, we are going to clean up the terrain a bit, meaning removing the largest roots. Even being careful, I found them everywhere. You can cut them with large pruning shears, for example. We will also take the opportunity to remove the big stones, those about 10 centimeters to 15 centimeters. All right, let's move on to the third step, leveling. For this, you will need a rake. This is the longest and most difficult step for beginners because you have to level the ground, remove all weeds and scattered stones to get a perfectly flat terrain. I have my old lawn rake, and I recommend having the same. You can also use a hoe, but it will be much rougher. To level, we always work in reverse to avoid stepping on the already leveled areas. The first thing I do is remove the biggest debris. You see, the movement is not very complicated. You just pull the rake toward you. Then I go over it a second time to smooth it all out. Next, I use a rock fork to remove the biggest debris while keeping as much soil as possible. You can also use a shovel, but you might remove too much soil. Once this step is completed, we move on to the fourth step, sowing the lawn, either with a box if you don't have a large area or by hand spreading. You take a handful of seeds and scatter them. You shouldn't put too much, about 1 handful per square meter. If you put a little more or less, it's okay because the lawn spreads naturally. Be careful with the wind, otherwise your seeds will end up in your flower beds. Once this step is completed, we move on to the fourth step, sowing the lawn. Either with a box if you don't have a large surface, or by hand. You take a handful of seeds and scatter them. You must not put too much, about 1 handful per square meter. If you put a little more or a little less, it's not a big deal because the lawn spreads naturally. Be careful with the wind, otherwise your seeds will end up in your flower beds. Fifth step, raking. Take a leaf rake and work in reverse to bury the seeds and put them in contact with the soil. This also prevents birds from eating them. This step is highly recommended as it ensures the seeds make contact with the soil. You just need to bury them slightly. Sometimes it can be skipped, but I recommend doing it. Before moving on to the final step, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss other outdoor tutorials. Finally, the sixth step, rolling. You can rent one or buy one. It is advisable to do 1 to 2 passes as this compacts the soil and presses the seeds into the ground. For a small area, you can also use a wooden board, but it takes a long time. Congratulations! If you have followed all these steps, there is a good chance your lawn will sprout. However, be careful not to make the mistakes we will see next. Before that, here is some important information. First, do not water right after sowing. Wait for it to rain. Otherwise, it is pointless unless you want quick results. Also, know that there are two ideal periods for sowing grass: spring and autumn. Summer is strongly discouraged because the heat dries out the soil too quickly. Late summer maybe, but early summer is not recommended at all. You would need to water very regularly, and the grass wouldn't have time to take root before the first heat waves. It would then risk dying quickly. I must point out that this depends on where you are located in the world. For spring, you can choose periods like March, April, and May. And for autumn, it will be September, October, and mid-November, because after that, there will be frost coming. Check online based on your location. Personally, the best season I would say is autumn for two reasons. First, the grass will have plenty of time to take root throughout the autumn. Then winter arrives, so it won't dry out. In spring, it will still have time to root properly to really withstand the summer heat. Also in autumn, there will be much fewer weeds like dandelions and all that. I want to emphasize that the information about the sowing months may vary depending on your geographical location, so please take that into consideration. A quick word about mowing. Don't make the mistake of letting your grass grow for several months. What I advise you to do is, when your grass blades reach 5 to 10 centimeters, you can mow your lawn, which is about a month to a month and a half after it has started to sprout, meaning after it has begun to germinate. When you see green, be careful not to use a riding mower if your ground is too wet, because you risk ruining everything and creating holes everywhere with the tires. So either use a push mower, a helical blade mower, or a robotic mower. It is really crucial to mow it because by mowing, it will spread much faster. That's what I did at home, and I can tell you that within a week after mowing, you can see the grass really developing. You can see the roots growing and filling in all the gaps. Now let's talk about the mistakes to absolutely avoid. The first mistake is forgetting to water your grass. Let me explain. It is not necessarily useful to water your lawn unless you sow it a little too late and summer's approaching. If it starts getting really hot for 15 days, 3 weeks, and there is no rain, and your grass begins to germinate, and you see it turning green, be careful. Watch it closely because you might need to water it for proper growth. However, it is not something you need to do all the time. It's only necessary if you waited until June, for example, to sow your lawn. The second mistake, not using a seed mix. I strongly advise you to use at least 2 different seed species because if you encounter an issue, such as a fungus or disease affecting a particular type of grass like fescue or ryegrass, another variety will take over. Whereas if you only have one species, your entire lawn could be affected and you would have to start all over again. So I recommend checking here. In this lawn mix, we have 30% ryegrass and 70% fescue. Mistake number 3 is not sowing at the right time. You got it, either in spring or in autumn. A mistake that is not too serious would be not sowing enough. As I mentioned, about a handful of seeds per 1 square meter. Usually it's indicated on the package. However, if you notice too many empty spots, nothing prevents you from adding a few more seeds to fill them in. Another mistake would be burying the seeds too deep. If they are too deep, they won't germinate. So be mindful of that. I suggest just raking them in lightly. There's no need to bury them with a shovel. Simply flip the rake and drag it backward across the soil. Nothing too complicated. The next mistake, if you sow your lawn in autumn, you absolutely need to blow away any leaves on the young grass. If too many leaves pile up, the grass will rot underneath. So be careful. Either rake them or blow them away. It's the best option. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate to ask in the comments. I read all your comments. Subscribe so you don't miss the next videos, and give a thumbs up if you found this tutorial helpful. Thank you, and see you next time. All right, ciao, ciao.